We are talking with John Perkins. He is author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. John, talk about Saudi Arabia. That's a country that is very prominent in our current political climate, and you had firsthand experience with that country.
That's right, Mike. I think you're probably too young to remember the early 70s when we had cars lined up at gas stations. We had a severe oil shortage in this country, and it was because OPEC had finally exercised its power and decided that it was going to basically hold the United States up to ransom. It didn't like our policy in Israel particularly. And this became totally unacceptable to the United States government. We were afraid that we might have another depression like 1929, that this oil problem could really create that sort of a situation. So the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and a number of other economic hitmen, a very small group of us, and I went to Saudi Arabia and began looking at what the possibilities were. And it became very evident at the beginning that the key to making sure this would never happen again was Saudi Arabia. It was the largest producer in the world, and basically Saudi Arabia could control OPEC. Didn't have to control it politically, but if other countries decided that they were going to cut back on the supply of oil and Saudi filled in the gap, then it didn't do any good for these countries to decide this. So knowing that Saudi would be on our side would deter any foreseeable problems. So we had to win Saudi Arabia over. So we ended up putting together this deal whereby the House of Saud, the Royal House of Saudi Arabia, agreed to reinvest the petrodollars, most of its petrodollars, into U.S. government securities. The U.S. Treasury Department was given the right to use the interest from these government securities to hire U.S. companies to rebuild Saudi Arabia in a westernized image, to literally build cities straight out of the desert, to build big transmission lines, power plants, desalination plants, petrochemical industries, the whole works, to rebuild Saudi Arabia as a westernized country. And in exchange, we would guarantee that the House of Saud, the royal family, would continue to rule the country as long as they kept their deal with us. Part of their deal with us also assured that the price of oil would stay within limits that would be acceptable to us. This deal has held all these years, from the early 70s, and really it was finalized about the mid-70s, until today. It's still holding. This relationship still exists. We've always protected the House of Saud, including when they've done some things that seem pretty bad to us, like when Idi Amin, who was Africa's answer to Hitler, was finally overthrown by a coup. We wanted to try him. We wanted to bring him into our court system, or the world court system, but the Saudis offered him sanctuary in Saudi Arabia, where he lived like a king until last summer when he died there of disease. And certainly the Royal House of Saud has supported Osama bin Laden throughout, with our encouragement in Afghanistan when he fought the Russians, but ever since they're still supporting him. The bin Laden family is an extremely important family to the House of Saud, to Saudi Arabia, and to the Carlyle Group, which is, as most people know, aware of that group. And so this deal then was a very, very effective one that guaranteed the price of oil stay within acceptable limits, and that Saudi Arabia would be rebuilt as a westernized country, and we would defend the House of Saud. It's held up. It still holds up. There's a weakness today because many of the conservative Saudis have objected violently to what's going on, and there have been over 100 assassinations in the last year in Saudi Arabia. There's tremendous unemployment. There's a great deal of civil unrest in that country. I think the country's teetering on the verge of some sort of a social upheaval, a political upheaval. We may have to send troops there next. I also know that that's one of the reasons that we went into Iraq, because we feel that in order to protect our oil interests, we've got to control Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and we'd like to control Iran too.
Now, for you, Saudi Arabia was somewhat different, and maybe not for you, but for the U.S. arrangement with them was different, where they actually had the funds from their oil sales to be able to pay for everything. So how did you approach that?
Yes, that's right. It wasn't about making them a loan that would make them indebted to us. It was about working a deal that would make them tied to us. So when they send their petrodollars back here and put it in government securities, that gives us quite a lot of control over them. Plus, they signed this agreement whereby the interest would be used by our Treasury Department. And an interesting aside to that is that all this money that the Treasury spends and gives to U.S. corporations never has to be approved by the U.S. Congress because it isn't U.S. taxpayer money. It's Saudi money, even though it comes through the Treasury Department. Once we worked out this deal with Saudi Arabia, a person at a very high level went over and presented it to the royal family. I believe it was Henry Kissinger. And the heads of the royal family accepted it, but the caveat was that it had to get the approval of a number of crown princes. I was assigned to one of these crown princes to make sure that he approved of this plan. And this was a very interesting process because he was a strong Wahhabi, very conservative Islamic Arab. And he really didn't want his country to be westernized, so he rejected the plan from the very beginning. But he also let me know if he even wanted to, if I even wanted him to consider thinking about it, he would expect every time he came to the United States to have a beautiful blue-eyed blonde woman at his disposal. He wanted me to provide that for him. Put me in an awkward position, put me in the position of being a pimp and of actually doing something that was illegal. But I worked this out because I found this woman who was married to a United Airlines pilot. She met all the qualifications. She was beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed, and she was not very happy with her husband. She was happy with her lifestyle and everything her husband provided her, but he was fooling around with a lot of other women, and she knew this, and she was kind of angry about that. In addition, she had been a very promiscuous hippie a few years earlier, so sex was something she enjoyed, and getting a little extra money on the side and sort of socking it to her husband appealed to her. But she let me know that she'd only do it on the condition that she liked the prince. And the first time they got together, fortunately, they liked each other, and I had to pay for it. And this is one of these instances where you can't put it on your expense account. It's illegal. It's an illegal activity. But in those days, restaurants gave you receipts that were hand printed. They weren't using computers. And I was a big tipper at some very, very fine restaurants in Washington, New York, and Boston. And so when I tipped the waiters, I would always ask for an extra receipt. And I basically financed this pimping operation that I was going through off receipts from restaurants, and put those on my expense account. There was a lot of that kind of thing going on too. And eventually the prince came around and supported our plan, and it went forward in Saudi Arabia. And it's been in place ever since. Very effective.
There's been a lot of information coming out very recently about the Bush family ties to Saudi Arabia, doing business there. Were you aware of any of that back when you were working in that area?
Absolutely. And I do want to make it very clear here that empire building, the job of economic hitman, is not partisan. It goes across all administrations. It's the Republicans and the Democrats. The Bush family, of course, is very closely tied to oil, always have been. And well, I ran an energy company, also a successful one in the 80s, and I was very aware of what was going on with companies like Enron and George Bush, the current president's company. He had a couple of companies. The first one was named Arbusto, which means bush in Spanish, and then he nearly went bankrupt and sold his interest in that to another company called Spectrum 7, and they nearly went bankrupt and sold their interest to Harken Energy. It was interesting always from my perspective because Bush kept failing and kept selling his companies, and every time he sold them, he'd get put on the board of the new company and paid huge salaries. And it's like, gee, I wish I could do that. It must be pretty amazing to be in a position where you don't do anything right, but then you get paid for it. Fascinating to watch Harken Energy, which he then was on the board of and very instrumental. A major oil company was negotiating a contract with Bahrain, a Mideast country, and Harkin then got into the picture, and when the first President Bush became president, suddenly